But now on BBC Two.
It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Alicia Cairns, SNP MP Stephen Flynn, the Daily Mirror's political editor Pippa Crerar and author and journalist Tim Marshall. Today, the government unveils its net zero strategy.
Green is good. Green is right. Green works.
£5,000 to replace your boiler is amongst the measures, but is it enough?
Quite simply, there isn't enough funding to really be able to roll this out at scale.
We'll hear from a Tory MP concerned about the cost to the taxpayer and the consumer. Remembering Sir David Amiss, should there be a new law in his name?
So let's put, if I may be so presumptuous, David's law onto the statute book.
Welcome. We're going to start with the government's heat and building strategy. Let's just show you this tweet from the business department. You heard there in the headlines, £5,000 grants for heat pumps and other low-carbon heating in England and Wales. By 2030, heat pumps should cost the same as gas boilers, reducing our dependency on fossil fuels and exposure to global price spikes. Now, we are expecting an overall net zero strategy from the UK government shortly, but let's just concentrate on the plan for homes and buildings just for the moment. Alicia, are you going to replace your gas boiler with a heat pump?
In time I will be, because that's what we're announcing today. Is we're not forcing anyone to do this, we're supporting people. And actually, this is the starting gun for COP26. This is exciting, as the Prime Minister said, green is good, green is go. It's a good thing that lets people make a difference, because I think 30% of carbon emissions come from our homes. So if we don't improve what we do at home, we can't make a massive difference overall on climate change.
Sure. And in time means what? In the next year, 2 years, you'll be making that change?
Well, it was announced this morning, so I've got to speak to my husband. We make our decisions as a family. But yes, I'll be trying to bring it in as soon as possible. And the good news is, as Octopus Energy has said this morning, they think the prices are going to absolutely drop as this becomes a new economy for us. So that's exciting times for jobs in our country as well.
Stephen, is this a discussion in your home? Are you going to be replacing your gas boiler anytime soon?
I've obviously been discussing this with my wife for a considerable period of time, because as we make that transition to net zero, we all need to be cognizant of our own energy output and the amount of usage that we're using. What I'm hoping for is that in the not too distant future, we'll have a situation where hydrogen-ready boilers will be good and ready to go, and the technology will be there to support that. And hopefully between that and heat pumps, we'll be in a situation where homes can be decarbonised to a level where net zero can be achieved. That has to be the aim of all of us.
Tim, are you making the leap?
I've got an electric car with a heat pump, if that helps.
Well, that's...
and if the government wants to put me on the priority list of to give me £5,000, I'll do it next week. The issue, as I understand it, is, although this is a welcome initiative, 85% of homes in this country are gas central heated. That's what, 25 million homes? Yeah. And I think that they're going to do 30,000 a year. Yes,
Alicia, it's a drop in the ocean.
Yeah, but we have to start somewhere. And ultimately, people, when you look at my inbox, and I think the inbox of any MP, people are constantly saying, how do I play my part in climate change? And we're making it possible now for people to do that. And I agree with Stephen. I also want to see hydrogen. I want to see hydrogen come to the East Midlands. We can be the hydrogen kind of superpower of the UK. But we don't make change like this through government diktat. We need to support the market, support those changes. And this £5,000 grant is a big one, particularly when we think prices are going to reduce so much for these heat pumps.
Pippa, are you going to change?
As and when, absolutely. But there's a long way to go, and there is obviously the concern that this isn't necessarily ambitious enough when the amount of funding set out will, as Tim rightly says, fund 30,000 pumps a year, and the government's own target is for 600,000 a year by 2028. possibly not enough money there, particularly when the cost of pumps at the moment is between 6,000 and 18,000, and the subsidy obviously is for 5,000. Obviously they'll come down over time, but you have to wonder whether it's ambitious enough to deliver on the aims that the government actually wants to get from the end of this.
Let me just show you all and our viewers this article in The Sun from the Prime Minister. The boiler police are not going to kick your door in with their sandal-clad feet and seize at Carrot Point, I should say, your trusty old combi. Harder to read that than it looks at first sight, I have to say. Let's talk to Conservative MP Craig McKinley. You're one of the Tory MPs who has raised concerns about the cost of getting to net zero and the impact on households. Listening to what the Prime Minister's written in The Sun, are you reassured?
No, I'm wholly opposed to a lot of this, not least because of the cost and the cost to the people who are on lower incomes. I mean, the £5,000 grant, all very welcome, of course, but these heat pumps are very expensive. They have to have this type of subsidy to get anybody interested in them. And the worry has got to be, will it be people who are possibly better heeled in life will take that leap and say, well, thanks very much, I'll bank the £5,000 and I can afford the other 5, 7, 10, whatever else it will cost to actually have one of these heat pumps. And so, I'm worried that, again, it will be the poorer paid that will suffer from this. I've got no intention of getting an air source heat pump. Right. Those who have had them installed and installers I've spoken to said they really don't work very well in our climate. But let's get down to cost. This is what's really important. The dreams and ideals, yes, of course I want to leave this planet in a better place than I found it. We all want that. But I think there are other things we can do and do them better. I'm very worried that we're going into an interim technology, a little bit like the Betamax of videotape, and it really wasn't the settled solution. I think the settled solutions will come, and in my view, it's certainly not air source heat pumps financed by the taxpayer.
Alicia?
I mean, heat pumps are going to be the future, as is hydrogen in terms of powering our homes. And there's actually an important point here in terms of reliance. So if we don't do this, if we don't build this new heat pump economy within the UK where we create jobs and create them ourselves, China will do it and we will become reliant on them. But essentially the grant needs to go to those who need it most. Octopus Energy says that by April 2022, they think the price will have plummeted. And this isn't in isolation either. The government's also announced £3 billion for insulation, for those in social housing and also for public sector buildings. So it's just one part of it, but we want to embrace heat pumps, make sure we are creating them locally in our own country because they will be the future as we decarbonise.
Craig?
Can I put on the record here 3 sources of information about the cost of decarbonising our domestic homes? Now, there's one from London councils released last week. They estimate London properties will cost £98 billion a year. That's for 14% of the UK's domestic housing stock. Bulk that up, that means 700 billion for the entire country. Inside Housing, who are specialists in social housing, they estimated just the social housing stock would be £104 billion. Multiply that up, they estimate the cost of across the whole UK, 500 billion. But a very interesting one just last week again from the Scottish government. So these aren't sources that are, in my making. These are independent sources. They estimate 33 billion for just 1 million homes in Scotland. There are 2.9 million homes in Scotland. I know the weather's a little bit more inclement than down this way. But you bulk that up and you're into 960 billion across the UK. These are eye-watering figures to save 0.14% of global CO2. Now, that increment of 0.14% of global CO2 is made up probably in every 2 months by new coal-powered stations in China. Right. This is greenwash gone mad.
Alicia?
I mean, look, we all have to play our part. No one's saying that it's going to be cheap. But what we all say is it's important and it's fundamental. And as I said, people want to make a difference in their own homes, and now we're offering them the opportunity to be able to do it. Right,
but do you accept it will be the well-heeled, as Craig has said it, and actually so have Friends of the Earth, that will be the only people who can really afford to do it, even with the grant?
Because we have to make sure that it's not just those well-heeled. That's where politicians step in. That's where government steps in. It's our job to make sure it's not just them. And, the fact the market is already saying prices are going to go down so much, it will be gradual, but we will get there in time.
Right. If I can just put some of those points to you, Stephen, you speak for the SNP on these issues of business and energy in the Commons. You heard what Craig said. Are those figures, you stand by those figures, do you think this £5,000 grant is pretty substantial.
I think it's a starting point for England and Wales, absolutely. I think the UK government could be going a lot further. But where I struggle with the argument that Craig's putting forward is his notion that this is going to hit the poorest the hardest. And lest we forget the fact that the UK government's just came off of taking away £20 per week away from the poorest in society in the midst of a gas energy price hike crisis. So I'm really struggling with his argument that on one hand he thinks it's going to hit the poorest, whilst on the other hand supporting government measures which will automatically hit the poorest. What we need to see from the UK government is real investment going forward in a whole plethora of technologies. And we've talked about the poorest in society. District heat networks have a key role to play within that. Hydrogen has a role to play with that, and so does heat pumps.
All right.
But this is a starting point.
If someone is buying a heat pump in Scotland, what kind of grant would they get from the Scottish Government?
I'm not aware of that at this moment in time off the top of my head.
So there isn't a grant at the moment?
I'm not aware of that at the top of my head at this moment in time, Joe. I'm sure.
Should there be?
I'm sure that there will be a grant for people.
And will it be more generous, do you think, than £5,000 then per household?
I would certainly expect it to be just as generous, if not more generous, because we have to be cognizant of the specific difficulties in Scotland. We have a very rural population. There's many people in Scotland who live in fuel poverty. Right. We also have to acknowledge the fact that in Scotland it's significantly colder, and that's why we're extremely frustrated that at this moment in time there's so many households in Scotland who've been hammered by a universal credit cut at the same time as their energy prices are going through the roof. So Craig's crocodile tears should go and belong somewhere else.
Well, Craig, your crocodile tears?
Well, all of this is predicated on a massive supply of electricity. Now, we haven't solved that problem yet. We resorted last week to firing up coal-powered stations and relying on interconnect electricity coming from France and the rest of Europe, much of which was actually coal-powered. And we're seeing gas price rises. The SNP spokesman, I get it. I get the problems of the cost of living at the moment. I really do. But the cost of gas, the spike that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, is of our own making. We closed down the Rough storage field, refusing new permits in the North Sea, and yet no matter what your view of is the dash to net zero, whether it's fast or slow, we will have fossil fuels, gas and all the rest of it in the mix for at least a generation. My view is we'd be better off doing that domestically with a security of supply, a security of price, and not being reliant on foreign regimes, most notably Russia, where we transfer billions of euros and pounds to them to actually create weapons of offence against us. I mean, it's a geopolitical policy you could barely make up. It's a nonsense.
Right. Well, Stephen, before I go to the other guest, do you want to respond?
Yeah, the real problem here in terms of the energy price crisis has been the fact that the UK government has failed over decades to invest in renewable technologies. And we're seeing the consequences of that today as well, with the fact that the ACOM project in the northeast of Scotland, the carbon capture and underground storage project, which also has a hydrogen element to it, and hydrogen is crucial to ensuring our net zero ambitions, as we've already talked about in terms of hydrogen boilers. The UK government has decided that they will not be funding the ACOM project in Scotland and will instead be directing that funding to projects in England. So not only are they turning their back on renewable projects, but when hydrogen is possible, it can be created. The UK government is failing to deliver for Scotland once again. That's the reality of the situation at this moment.
All right, before I come to you, Alicia, Pippa, politically, stepping back, do you think Boris Johnson is worried about the impact that these announcements and policies are going to have and are having on people like Craig McKinley and voters who feel the same way?
He clearly is. I mean, he's written an op-ed in The Sun this morning. He's been reaching out to a lot of his backbench MPs in blue-collar seats, red wall seats, trying to reassure them. They're obviously very concerned about the impact on the cost of living. But the one thing I'd say about that is I think it's actually quite patronising, suggesting that voters in these places are not concerned about climate change. All the evidence from the British Election Survey, YouGov, all the main pollsters suggest that actually people in these parts of the country think the same way as people anywhere else, other than possibly on Brexit, but that they share the same concerns, and that tackling climate change is one of the issues that they think the government should be making a priority, just as other people in other parts of the country also feel.
Tim, your views, having listened to the debate so far?
You do need a very clear-eyed view on two things, and one is the practicalities of it. And I think it is going to be difficult. I do agree you have to start somewhere, you have to do something. And I know the same opinion polls say that we are all concerned, and we are, but when you dig into the opinion polls, If it then asks, are you prepared to pay X, Y, and Z, support rapidly falls away. That is problematic for any government of whatever colour, anywhere, because if it really did want to push the big red emergency button and say, this is what we actually need to do and are going to do, they won't get in next time. And so you get these not entirely full-throated measures.
Right, and perhaps what makes it more difficult to convince certain people is this graph. I'll just explain to Tim and Alicia, but our viewers can see it and our guests here in the studio. Total greenhouse gas emissions by country 2019. China way ahead, as we know, 27%. And there at the bottom, or certainly close to the bottom, is the UK on 0.9%. What do you say in response to that, Alicia?
We all have to play our part, but absolutely China is a priority. And I think what we've seen under the COP26 presidency is we've taken, I think it's from 30% of global GDP was covered by net zero commitments when we took over presidency, and that's now at 70%. But I don't think any of us are sat there thinking that China isn't crucial to this, and we have to find a way to bring China to the table and see them get involved with COP26 and with climate change. They have to be a serious partner on this.
Right, although we don't know, or in fact, I'm pretty sure the president isn't coming, is he, to COP26? Tim, your response? I mean, this is a global picture. It's not just about the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. It does not abrogate our responsibilities as a country and as individuals to do something. But we do have to understand that we are actually one of the better nations in attempting to do things. The problem with COP, and I've been writing, good cop, bad cop, I think it's going to end up bad cop, not because of the UK government's fault. It's not Boris Johnson's fault if President Xi doesn't turn up, as he's probably not going to. And Putin is busy toying with him, I think, keeping him on tenterhooks. The problems lie behind the great names. You're probably aware of the NDC's, nationally determined contributions. At COP26, a country's supposed to rock up and say, right, here's our new NDC, we're going to do this by that date. 100 countries have, but the big players, China, Russia and India, haven't. And they're already slipping way behind this 2050 target. And if we don't get these NDCs declared at COP, at Glasgow, I don't see how the conference is going to be a success. As I said, not the UK government's fault. I mean, China, for example, is talking about 2060 for zero. And India and China, and this is really crucial, India and China are both at the moment increasing coal production because they're trying to restart their economies after COVID. And last brief point, both of those countries say to the other advanced countries, you're the ones who did all the polluting. Why should we have to do anything because it's your responsibility? And they won't discuss it.
Right. Well, that is an important point, isn't it, Alicia? I mean, it is a fair thing to say, isn't it, that the West has been polluting for, however long, and they have large areas of poverty in the countries that are the biggest emitters, and they want to continue to use fossil fuels.
I don't think that's necessarily a helpful argument, though, because we didn't know about these things a long time ago, and we now all know. And as responsible member states, as a responsible community, we have to work together and do more. It's not enough to say, oh, well, a long time ago someone else did something. There are ways in which to work. Nations with space programs should not be saying, oh, but we can't afford to decarbonise. There is a real challenge, but I think I work at the Foreign Office. Before every big conference, every big delegation, people always say, oh, we're not going to achieve very much. And Tim's points are completely valid. But for example, we know that Russia just announced that they want to decarbonise by 2060. They're sending 200 officials, America sending 1,000. In terms of Putin coming or not, at the moment, he makes anyone that comes to see him quarantine for 2 weeks before they meet with him. That includes Russians. So I think there's a big question about whether someone who has that sort of policy in place is realistically going to come to a conference.
Craig, just the success or not of COP26, what's your view before you go?
Well, the whole thing has to be a global effort. I don't mind global efforts. I'm very much in favour of those. But your figures of 0.9% for the UK, I think, tells its own picture. President Xi, it seems, does not particularly want to come. You've got growing economies like India and Indonesia are building coal-powered stations like they're going out of fashion. If we want to go on a pathway that's going to completely offshore every remaining bit of high energy industry in this country, we're going a very good way about it. I didn't get elected to make my constituents both colder and poorer. I think we need to pause, think about this, and get some technological solutions that are going to work and get to those net zero ambitions on a similar glide path. And that has to include serious nuclear.
Stephen, you were shaking your head. How do you convince Craig?
I was shaking my head at the notion that Craig is saying he doesn't come into politics to make his constituents poorer or colder, when of course his government has done that.
But on this issue, you've made that point.
But in terms of this specific issue, this is a global challenge that needs a global solution, and the UK, the West collectively, needs to work together to bring nations across the world together in Glasgow to deliver on the net zero targets that we need to meet. And what we need when we are approaching this, and Craig needs to keep this in mind, everyone needs to keep this in mind, what is the cost of not doing this? That is the big thing. What is the consequences going to be to communities right across the world, but also those here in Scotland and across the UK who are going to have to deal with the consequences of climate change? All
right, Craig McKinley, thank you very much. We're going to talk about Sir David Amiss, the Conservative MP who was killed on Friday while carrying out work in his constituency. MPs were paying tribute to him in the Commons yesterday. Let's take a look at this tweet from our guest, Alicia Cairns, showing there the seat on which Sir David often sat, with a message asking people to leave it vacant. Alicia, what did you make of the tributes yesterday?
I think what was really wonderful was just that seeing how many of us have the same memories, the same heartfelt joy when we think of David. Friday was heart-shattering because he has supported so many of us, even new MPs like me, since before we were elected. And he always did that with that gentle, kind, but cheeky, humorous personality that he was. You know, the last time I spoke to him was only last week when he was in Qatar, and he was helping to help me get some Afghan refugees from Qatar to the UK. This is the man that when I texted and said, I know you've just landed from a long flight, but please can you help? He said, of course, whatever you need, I'll do whatever I can to help. It hurts, and it hurts all of us. And I just hope that we can see some change nationally in how we approach politics and how we embrace dialogue, and recognising that division can only lead to more pain and hurt. But I'm so grateful to everyone for the amazing memories they shared and stories they shared, whether it was from Pope's blessing sweets to praising people for their English, perhaps where it wasn't justified. He was a great man, and it's an enormous loss to our nation.
Well, in terms of changes that have been called for, Alicia, sitting next to that vacant seat was the Conservative MP Mark Francois. He was a close friend of Sir David Amiss and used part of his speech to call for tougher online laws. Let's have a listen.
I suggest that if we want to ensure that our colleague didn't die in vain, we collectively, all of us, pick up the baton, regardless of our party, and take the forthcoming online harms bill and toughen it up markedly. So let's put, if I may be so presumptuous, David's law onto the statute book, the essence of which would be that while people in public life must remain open to legitimate criticism, they can no longer be vilified or their families subject to the most horrendous abuse, especially from people who hide behind a cloak of anonymity. Yeah.
On that issue, Pippa, I mean, there is clearly a huge problem involving politicians being abused online. We hear it all the time, and I'll ask our two politicians today again. But is that a separate issue from the suspected terror attack on Friday?
Well, it's an honourable aim to try and clean up the internet, not least because, I mean, the abuse that MPs get, obviously, but also the anonymity that people hide behind for all sorts of other reasons. The online harms bill is coming up in December, and MPs will have a moment to try and toughen that up there. But the point you make, Joe, is absolutely right, that this, of course, is a separate issue, serious though it may be, and police are currently investigating any terror-related links, looking at Islamist extremism when it comes to the suspected murderer. And that, of course, is quite a distinctly different issue.
Right. Do you accept that, Stephen?
I think what we need to reflect upon is the fact that so many politicians, it's almost become the norm to be attacked.
Are you?
Oh, of course, yeah, absolutely. Some fairly vile messages and emails, always drop them into my email. And I'm not the most high profile of politicians. But what I do see is my female politicians in particular, my female colleagues, like Sir Kirsty Blackman, Joanna Cherry, Carol Monaghan, treated with the most vile abuse that's ended up in the courts on a consistent basis. It's wrong. And if we, in some way, shape or form, can strengthen the law to help stop this from happening, then we should all try and achieve that. Whether it can happen is
what does that look like, strengthening the law, in your mind?
I'm not entirely sure, and I think that's the big difficulty here. I don't disagree with what Mark was saying yesterday. I don't think anyone disagrees with what Mark was saying, but the practical application of that is going to be the difficulty, and how we overcome those barriers is going to be the problem. Now, I'm open to that, and if people can come forward with solutions to that problem, then I'll support them and engage with that, as I'm sure everyone would.
Well, one of the key things is that under the current plans for the Online Harms Bill, there's a duty on firms, big tech giants, to regulate illegal and harmful material, but it's very difficult to define what exactly that is. And one suggestion that's been made is that there could be a much clearer definition, categorisation of what that abuse looks like and whether it's acceptable or not.
Right. I mean, Alicia, do you think there is a link between online abuse and actual violence? Do we need to see a change in legislation in the way Marc Francois outlined?
It is one ecosystem, and we're completely wrong if we try to suggest it's not, because when you dehumanise people, when you vilify them, that is the start on a journey of hatred. And these terrorists, people, they find a flag to which to tie their colours. It is about their personal psychology, their personal anger, their personal desire to burn the world to the ground. But when you start dehumanising and vilifying politicians, it is the start of a journey that legitimises for these individuals the action that they then take against us. So we have to change how we talk about each other, how we talk to each other, and then we have to deal with the distinct terrorists themselves. But threats, court cases, me having to explain to my 3-year-old why my friend had been killed, people threatening me at surgeries, my staff every day see the most abusive and vile emails and phone calls, and it is not acceptable. And it is also not acceptable that we have staff around the parliamentary estate asking how they can save an MP's life in the future. That shouldn't be the kind of duty they feel. So we have to deal with the hate. The social media companies haven't done enough for a long time. When I worked on fighting ISIS many years ago, back in 2015, 2016, we were having these conversations with them about extremism, and they were too slow and they didn't take enough action. The same on anti-Semitism now. They have a duty. They are publishers. When you sign up to any of these platforms, you sign up to a code of conduct. So when people break this code of conduct, social media companies should hold them to account for breaking them, and they're just not doing it.
The issue of anonymity, Tim, and Marc Francois and others have called for anonymous online accounts to end. Do you support that?
So this is one...
Oh, sorry, Alicia, I was just putting that to Tim. Apologies.
Excuse me, sorry. I think it's problematic because you don't have the right to anonymity, but given how far we've gone and given how little the social media giants really care about this, because they don't, they just pay lip service to it, I think I would reluctantly agree that perhaps you should no longer have that. I was on an iteration of this program 5 or 6 years ago, arguing that the social media companies need to be counted as publishers, not just platforms, because once they are enshrined as publishers, then they would be forced to do more than just lip service.
Before we move on, I just want to ask you, Alicia, about a story that has just broken in the last hour or so. I'm just going to show everybody this headline. Manchester Arena inquiry. Bomber's brother leaves UK before hearing. You are on the National Security Strategy Committee. This is Ismail Abedi, 28 years old, the elder brother of the Manchester Arena suicide bomber, has left the UK ahead of an appearance at a public inquiry he'd been ordered to attend. What's your response?
I mean, I think that's deeply concerning. Justice needs to be done, and all those victims and survivors deserve to see justice done. So they think there are questions to be answered around why that individual was able to leave the country. I don't know if they're being monitored by the security services, but if they were, that would be a concern, because ultimately that person leaving could result in less justice, and that would be fundamentally wrong. So it's something we need to look at and understand more as the story develops.
Right. I mean, how concerned are you?
I mean, I don't know. We just don't know the extent of this individual's involvement or activities. They haven't been charged with anything. So we have to take from that they were not an active participant or supporter of it. I don't know. So we will have to wait and see. Obviously, that person's evidence has felt important enough for them to be called and forced to give evidence against their brother. So I think it's something we're going to have to look at very closely and understand if there were issues, why they arose.
All right, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about your book, Tim, The Power of Geography. And in it, you say that the UK has been searching for a global role since the mid-20th century. How do you think Brexit has affected that search?
It's simplified it and complicated it simultaneously, because it has freed it up to go and find this new role, Global Britain or whatever you want to call it. It has given it the flexibility to reinvent itself, but simultaneously it's made it incredibly difficult because, you know, we are just a senior middle-ranking country without the purchasing power to do the sort of trade deals that we could do inside the European Union. But I do see a lot of elements of that flexibility now appearing, and I'm not making a case for or against Brexit. You know, I try to look at things dispassionately, and you don't have to wrap yourself in the flag, nor do you have to have a jaundiced view of the UK's past to be able to look at something clearly and say that there are huge opportunities in a world that is very different, not just post-Brexit, but post-Cold War, 21st century technology. All the architecture of the world is being constructed again. There was a 20-year hiatus because the Americans got so involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now I think that architecture is properly being put into place. And the UK is in a reasonable position to take advantage of that.
Alicia, you sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee as well, busy woman that you are. What do you think Global Britain actually is? Are you satisfied you know what it involves?
It's about charting a future where we recognise that we need to be more strategic in terms of what are the interests of the UK. Where do we need to, first priority is to protect our people abroad and at home. That should be the foremost priority of any government. And then our prosperity, our interests and our alliances. And what I think we're seeing, so AUKUS for me is a real kind of heart of what this future is, because the way we...
This is the security alliance with the United States and Australia, yeah.
The way we protect ourselves, but also the way that we further our interests, whether it be in terms of the Pacific tilt or so on, is through a constellation of alliances. We need these alliances to be able to tilt, to be able to protect ourselves. So NATO, Five Eyes, the Five-Power Defence Agreement, AUKUS. This is actually the future of how we shape the prosperity and safety of our nation. And I'm excited by those because I saw firsthand how we were constrained when we were within the EU in terms of foreign affairs and defence. So I think we're finding that the doors remain open. The UK has always, what we're great at when it comes to the international community is being the convener. We bring other nations together. We help them ascertain how they can work together. We act as a secretariat for a lot of organisations and international efforts. And that's what we will continue to do.
All right.
But this combination of alliances is absolutely fundamental.
Do you agree, Stephen?
I think when you look at Global Britain and you strip away the slogan, the reality is that Britain's foreign policy is one of the key drivers behind Scottish independence. It's one of the key reasons why I believe Scotland can do things differently. Because when I look at Britain's foreign policy, what I see is the Iraq war. What I see is the UK government providing weapons to the Saudis to bomb the people of Yemen. I see Brexit. I see the hostility towards the European Union that's came with that. I see the dehumanisation of budgets. I see the chaos of the departure from Afghanistan. I see nuclear weapons off the coast of Scotland that should not be there. That's the reality of Global Britain, and it's quite frankly not something that I want to be part of. And I think those of my generation and below are quite sick, fed up of it, which is why when you look at the opinion polls, young people in Scotland don't want to be part of the United Kingdom.
Tim?
Some of what has been said on both sides is correct. I mean, the UK is in a good position to take advantage. It is in Five Eyes, AUKUS and all the rest of it. This is what I meant about the architecture of the 21st century is currently being built. And as you probably know, Joe, Britain is now a Pacific nation, apparently, because it does look like we're going to go into the comprehensive agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Japan wants us in. So all this is happening. It's a work in progress. It may not work, but it is all happening. And yet some of those criticisms, I think, are also valid. But what sometimes happens is that people who take a certain view Sometimes because they're being willfully unpleasant, but sometimes because they simply don't understand enough about the world, do sort of think of Britain as this sort of irrelevant power. I mean, it's just so far from the truth. As I said, you don't have to be, wrap yourself in the flag patriot to understand that it is a senior second-tier power and is destined to remain so. I was with the board of a household name German company a couple of years back, and I said, do you think the UK, after Brexit, will still be a top 10 economic power in the world in 10 years' time? And they said, absolutely it will. I mean, that's the reality of the UK. It's geographically in a very good position. I was interested in what Stephen said about the nuclear weapons. I mean, this is something I write about in the book. It's sort of a side issue because we're not there yet. But in the event of Scottish independence, we heard what Stephen said. The SNP, if it was the government, would not allow the British independent nuclear deterrent to be based in the Clyde, and consequently the UK for a period of time would not have that UK independent nuclear deterrent. That keeps the MOD awake at night.
Ah, Alicia, does it keep you awake at night?
Keeping our country united is absolutely a priority for me. It matters fundamentally. The bonds of friendship and family between Scotland, England, Northern Ireland and Wales. And I think actually that's what's played out over the last year and a half, whether it's the vaccine programme, whether it's money to shore up Scottish jobs, whether it's military driving ambulances in Scotland. I think, and that plays out in the polls. People don't want to be talking about independence at the moment. They want to be talking about working together as a unit, as one great nation all together to recover economically from all we've been through, because we've all shared the same scars and the same pain and the same hurt of the last period. And now we want to rebuild and come back better and do that together.
Right, Stephen?
Well, of course, everyone across the world has had to reel from the awful situation of the pandemic over the course of the last 18 months to 2 years, and we've all had to face individual challenges in that way. But the notion that people don't want to talk about independence is, quite frankly, for the birds. There was a Scottish Parliament election in May of this year, which appears to have escaped Alicia's notice, and the SNP recorded our record victory in that election. So the people of Scotland have been quite clear that they want their democratic choice to choose their own future, and that's an important point. This is about democracy. The people of Scotland voted for parties who want to hold a second independence referendum, and the people of Scotland should not be denied that right now or at any time in the future.
Pippa?
Of course, the people of Scotland also voted for a party that they wanted to run Holyrood and to run Scotland, and it wasn't just about independence. In fact, independence wasn't even the top consideration for most people. And I think it's fair to say that half of Scots might want to revisit the independence issue, but the other half firmly don't. And Nicola Sturgeon's actually quite cautious on this. And despite all the promises about when we're going to see a referendum coming forward, of course, there's no suggestion that the UK government are going to facilitate that anytime soon. Despite all her promises, I think she's inherently quite cautious. And with the polls currently as they are, which suggest really that it's more tied than it has been for a long time, and in fact that demands to stay in the union would triumph if there was an immediate referendum. I can't see her wanting one until she's convinced that it could be won.
Or through the pandemic, as the SNP government has said, which could be years away, couldn't it, Stephen?
No, the First Minister has been quite clear that it's our intention to hold an independence referendum prior to 2023, or certainly within 2023, and that's something that I support. It's what the people of Scotland went to the polls in May and backed parties, both the SNP and the Greens. We hold a significant majority in the Scottish Parliament in relation to anyone who has a disagreement in relation to this point, is that if you don't think that the people of Scotland are going to vote for independence, what you should accept is the fact that they have the right to choose, because if we don't support that democratic act, then we're in seriously difficult waters on these islands.
Right, let's return to the issue, Tim, on that basis, to the geography matters. Isn't there likely to be a deep and enduring cooperation between England and an independent Scotland if that were to happen?
I think there would have to be. I mean, because Scotland's biggest trading partner would be the one that it had a land border with by considerable amount. And of course, most of Scottish trade to other countries, other than the rump UK, a lot of it would go through English ports. And so there would have to be. Defence, there would have to be some sort of agreement, but I cannot see the SNP agreeing to the nuclear submarines being based there. And flowing from that, there would be all sorts of issues about it would be very difficult for Scotland to join NATO, should it wish to, because of the nuclear issue. I mean, there's an awful lot of complications. But yes, I think that what would still hold them together, albeit in a more loose relationship, would be greater than the difficulties that would divide them. The UK, the Rump UK, I should say, would also lose probably one of its fast response jet bases up in the far north of Scotland. And if you believe that Russia is not a benign player in the world, and it does every day test the UK's air defences, that would also be something that would diminish the Rump UK's ability to react. But I mean, essentially, I think a lot of this would come down to with that. Well, we probably don't have time to talk about the currency, but that would also be an issue.
We'll park the currency just a moment. I'm sure that's time for another programme. But Pippa, in that sense of geography still mattering and the issue of trade, the UK may have left the EU, but we are still very involved with our closest neighbours, France.
Well, yes. I mean, they are. We've seen that manifest itself daily with all the sort of difficulties we've been having with everything from fishing disputes to refugees, and whether France is doing its bit or we're not paying enough in terms of stopping them coming across the channel and putting their lives in danger. And then, of course, the big supply chains issue, which we're all facing. You know, every time you go to the supermarket, if you start to look for your kids' toys for Christmas, all the concerns about supply, which are really clear when you look at how much of our goods come in from the continent, and there's a lorry driver shortages, which yes affect others too, but they obviously have a ready supply of labour from neighbouring European states that we don't have access to. Well,
including, as Pippa was alluding to there, the argument over fishing rights, Alicia. I think I can just show our viewers this story in the Express, which is President Macron erupts. French set Boris 2-week deadline for new Brexit fishing deal, and that is ongoing, isn't there, with no sign of a solution?
Look, we have a trade and cooperation agreement with the French on this, and I actually met with representatives of the Jersey government at a Conservative Party conference. They have been incredibly fair. They have stuck to the agreement. They have adhered to the agreement. They actually gave the French until the end of September. They extended their fishing rights for longer as a sign of goodwill. The fact is, we've been very generous. We will keep adhering to the rules, to the agreement, and hopefully we can move forward and do that. The French have been asked to provide evidence about history of fishing.
Then to Annick Girardin, the French Minister of the Sea, great title, where she says at the end of this tweet, hashtag Brexit, hashtag I want my licences back.
Nous sommes votre ami. We are your friend. We're here. We want to do business with you, and we want to do it fairly. Let's take the heat out of this. Let's work together. We're working to the agreement we agreed. Let's come together and make it happen and make it work, and let's be good neighbours.
All right, très bien, as they would say, if we continue on this French vein. I think we've just got time. Actually, I said we would bring you a little bit of the zero strategy. Oh, we haven't got it quite yet. They've been in the House of Commons. Are you confident, though, Alicia, then, since we've only got a minute and a half left, that actually the UK is going to be able to weather its relationship with France?
I think we have to. You know, the relationship with France is so long-lasting. There will always be points of disagreement. It's nothing new that we have points of disagreement with the French. And I can tell you that from not only what we see in the media, but from having worked with them on a very intimate basis on security and military affairs, there will always be points of contention. There will always be points of not. The British love making the French the butt of their jokes. The French like making us the butt of their jokes. We need to find a way to come together. We have a lot and we have a lot we want to work on. Let's focus on realities. Let's get down to brass tacks and let's move forward.
Well, there are only a few sort of 30 seconds or so left. Tim, will that wash?
Yes. Look, we've got a very long history, but most of the time we've been not fighting each other. We've been getting on with each other. Take a look at the map. Look at where the UK is. Look at its indented shoreline with its deep ports and its ocean going, and then look at that massive market right across. Get the politics right, which we're working on. Get the economics right. Geographically, we're opposite the greatest market in the world with direct access to the.
Well, on that note, we really haven't got time to answer that question. That's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests, and I'll be back tomorrow with Prime Minister's Questions at 11:15. Bye-bye.